Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Maximo Soso, and with Richard Sparks, my colleague from the University of Edinburgh, we have been coordinating this series of workshops since 2021, online workshops, um, the social analysis of penalty across boundaries. And we starting this year with our monthly encounters with this first session. Today is a great pleasure to welcome to this workshop series to Arda Ibikoglu. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Washington. He was a visiting lecturer at the University of Massachusetts and the sociology department of Bogazi University in Istanbul. Throughout the last decade, he worked at the sociology department of Antimbas University, Istanbul, and was a member of the executive board of the civil society organization in the penal system in Istanbul. Arda will present today a new paper he is working on, very interesting one, Penality and Antagonistic Struggles, the case of maximum security prison reform in Turkey. As many of you already know, we usually have a presentation of around half an hour, and then we will have the same amount of time for questions and answers. So, Arda, again, many thanks for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maximo. Greetings, everyone from Istanbul. Thank you to Maximo and Richard for inviting me to share my research. Let me share the screen with you first. Okay. Um, Let me immediately jump in because I planned it for a little bit longer, so I will try to be as fast as possible. You see pictures here from a simultaneous military operation to 20 prisons across the country on December 19, 2000. This operation involved work machines and gas bombs, and it was ironically, as you see the title there, ironically named Operation Return to Life because it aimed to end political prisoner hunger strikes. However, 32 people died in the process as the prisoners resisted. You see some of the scenes there. Eventually, actually, the state forces reached all the prisoners. I'll shortly discuss that. So, um, so this was essentially part of a penal reform process. In Turkish system, they are called the first version of them. There are now other with other letters like S and Ys, S types, Y types, but the F type prisons were maximum security prisons, and the sort of the Turkish system prison is based mostly on ward or dormitory prisons before 2000s. But as you might have noticed in the berth interior space with the bunk beds in the earlier pictures, they were mostly dormitories. Uh, with this new reform, the state aimed to institutionalize. Uh, okay, here we go. So these maximum type prisons, they were essentially small unit based cells for one person or three people. And the state began their construction in early 2000. The plan was to finish them in spring 2001. There was immediate political prisoner operation because they were fearful of isolation. And hunger strikes started on October 20th, sort of to preempt the state before the prisons were constructed. The operation Return to Life basically took place on December 19 to end the hunger strikes, transfer the political prisoners to these F types. You see the picture there on the left bottom. They are two-storied buildings for one person and three people rooms. And it was eventually successful. Mostly initially men were transferred to these prisons. There were even more hunger strikes. So during the operation, 32 people died. Afterwards, there were more than 100 people who perished in the hunger strikes. So the question is, why would a state simultaneously attack 20 of its own prisons where 32 people died? What was at stake here? Why such a violent conflict over these new prisons? So, addressing this question in my dissertation that I finished back in 2012 at the University of Washington, and at that point, embarrassingly, not having read Rebecca McLennan's work on prisons, it had come out in 2008, I had argued that the prisons had become a tool and an arena in broader political struggles. And actually, she makes a similar argument for American prisons throughout the 19th and early 20th century, where prisons had become a site and instrument in political struggles. So it's quite embarrassing. But based on that research and other secondary sources, I will repeat this argument today. However, benefiting from new approaches in the field, I hope I can offer a more theoretically sophisticated and comparative framework now. Um, Next slide. So I benefit from several literature here. I'm going to go real fast here. Several key works that sort of contributed to my thinking. Works situating penal change within a polity's historical, institutional, and socioeconomic background. Works that call for more focus on the state and its actions. Works analyzing penalty as a contested field where official and social actors struggle over uncertain outcomes, and also works that are shifting the focus away from penal relations where the state reigns supreme, sort of these works that decenter the state in penalty. And I am sort of gonna situate myself there, although I benefit from the others. So I'm gonna offer some concepts and my the way or new interpretations of some concepts, and I will try to decenter the state in penalty. So my argument is that, sort of repeating the same point, penalty is a site and instrument in political, which is also automatically antagonistic. I follow Chantal Mouffe here, and I'll talk about it. Political and antagonistic struggles between various official and non-state actors. So I start with the definition of. So let me open this argument a little bit up. What are the terms? What are the concepts? So my definition for penalty is all relations of punishment, both symbolic and material. So this definition is obviously very broad, but I believe penal scholars should address penal relations beyond the state's reach or interest as well. That's why I'm sort of coming up with a broad understanding. Uh, Penal power, my definition, control over penalty generates power and authority by playing a crucial role in the material and symbolic construction of social reality. So essentially, penalty is power laden. What I mean by this is that punishment provides answer to questions of who we are not, who's a legitimate political subject and who is not. So consequently, punishment affects the material and symbolic reordering of the world, of the social world. I will come up with sort of three characteristics here. First, I take penal power as inherently antagonistic, and this follows, as I said, Chantal Mouffe's argument that the political is itself antagonistic. There is always when we identify ourselves, we do that in contradistinction to an other. And although I don't think, I'm not aware, Chantal Mouffe doesn't directly talk about punishment or penalty per se, but this sort of thinking is actually not foreign to penal scholars. Durkheim's argument that punishment reinforces a certain moral order at the expense of criminals, it is also, I think, within this sort of thinking. And recently, Carvalho and Chamberlain's um, article on the concept of hostile solidarity again sort of reinforces this sort of an understanding. So that's one important definition for me, this inherent antagonism. Uh, so also, talking more about the penal power, the modern state offers or makes a sovereign claim over penal power. And this is, again, not too surprising because when we look at all sort of popular definitions of the state, when we talk about Weber, for instance, as legitimate monopoly of physical violence, Bourdieu adds legitimate monopoly of symbolic violence to it. So if we consider these definitions, then actually punishment or penal power, it is something that the state would like to have complete control over. But then, as my goal here is to theorize state-society relations in penalty, but also to decenter the state in penalty. penal power is, I consider it as always contested. So despite the state's claims, local official and non-state actors contest those claims in everyday life over and beyond penalty. I also add beyond here because, as per my argument, because I think those struggles may merge, and I'll hopefully try to show that in the empirical discussion. Continuing, so if when we focus on penal relations beyond the state's control and how they are contested, then I think we must acknowledge the existence of multiple penalties, as some other actors would have control over penal relations beyond the state's reach or interest. But on the other hand, we cannot deny the state's claims either. The state claims to a singular penalty that has a significant symbolic and material power behind it. So I think, in my understanding, we have to consider penalty is both a singular and as multiple. This is kind of irregular, but I think we have to take both of them into consideration. Um, so, and finally, as my last point in this part of the theoretical discussion, we have to also focus on how contestation over penalty is related to penal change. And this famously, Goodman, Page, and Palp's Breaking the Pendulum, one of their, I think perhaps the most important argument there is that struggle is the motor of penal change. I completely take that argument, but I think my addition is that as the form of conflict over penal power, so what kind of struggle? In my definition, I think the biggest struggle is over penal power or control over penalty or penalties. As this struggle, as this conflict moves from antagonistic to agonistic, penalty is increasingly stabilized. I don't think I will be able to test this hypothesis today just based on one case study. But I think the Turkish case kind of demonstrates that. I hope I'll be able to show that. So if then my argument is about sort of talking about different types of contestation, moving from antagonistic to agonistic, I actually offer a typology here. This is based on the late Eric Olin Wright's last book, I think, in 2019. He offers it's a kind of a crude metaphor, but he offers a typology on social conflict under capitalism. In his case, when society is imagined as a game, and basically he says, the conflict is over what game to play, over the variable rules of the game, and over moves within a specific set of rules. So similarly, if we imagine penalty as a game as well, first then category is whose game is this? So what kind of game are we playing? And I consider this as the antagonistic conflict because I think as the modern state aims to institutionalize its penal infrastructure to contain and or replace pre-existing penalties, it inevitably creates a conflict between the state and local or regional actors that claim penal power, that used to claim or now claim. So essentially, this is kind of an unbridgeable gap most of the time as the state wants to be the hegemon, as the monopoly force here. So, and examples here are especially from the early modern period or from, pretty much many places in the world, such as tribal leaders, religious leaders, or local political leaders, landlords, in the contemporary period, we can talk about like lynchings and mob justice, like works of Godoy or Gail Super. So essentially, where the state could not reach or does not have the interest to reach certain locations, certain relations. So essentially, I consider this category as a direct confrontation, and the state is not able to completely replace penal relations as they were. So we can get back to this if there are more questions. Let me move on to my second category here. So the second category is, if we still continue with this metaphor, uh, considering penalty as a game, is the second category is over the rules of the game. So this is the antagonistic conflict in brackets here. So here the penal power is contested within the penal infrastructure. So state to a great extent establish at least nominal control over penal relations. We can talk about a singular penalty perhaps. However, actors within the penal infrastructure vie for different rules to increase their authority. And here I rely on Michael Mann's concept of infrastructural power to describe the centralizing modern state's ability to pull social life into its territorially expanding infrastructural network. The more the state can penetrate territories through these radial institutions that link the center and the peripheries, collective power at the national level increases at the expense of local and regional powers. However, Mann argues that infrastructural power is a two-way street. So as the state increases its role as a central hub of social activity, it opens up room for social actors to quote unquote control the state, or here in my account, to shape the rules of the game as well. So, I mean, examples, we should definitely go with examples. I think the best example, I already mentioned Rebecca McLennan's book from the late 19th century, early 20th century, or actually throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, where they focus on prison labor in American prisons. And their account is really interesting because what we see is capitalist actors actually really transforming the prison into almost like a factory, and prisoners become wage laborers. And I would rather think of this as a very good example to the second category here. No one on paper uh, or legally does not question the state's right to punish, but actually what type of punishment are we talking about, what the rules are, is actually negotiated between the state and other actors, here in this case capitalist actors. This is basically the way I'm thinking about this, and I will basically discuss the political prisoner communes in Turkey when I come to it shortly in these terms as well. And finally, my last category is agonistic conflict over moves within a specific set of rules. And sort of my conceptualization of agonistic conflict is a little bit different than Goodman, Page, and Pelp's account. So here I limit this discussion to basically interest group politics. Neither the state's hegemonic claims over the penal infrastructure nor the rules of the game are challenged. So here essentially the rules are given and people are just trying to maximize their benefit. Obviously, these categories, though, are ideal typical in a real life. We could probably see overlapping cases, but I think this way of categorizing the contestation between different actors, I think it will prove useful. Here, again, this is borrowed from Eric Olin Wright's analysis, but I adapted to the case of penalty. So in antagonistic conflict, essentially the conflict is over independent penal power. And when there is change, it's huge. I mean, for instance, the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century, or at the similar period, a major restoration, as the modern state expands, territorially centralizes, what we see is great legal transformation, great penal change. Actually, the modern prisons were established in the Ottoman Empire exactly at this period. So it's ruptural change. When we talk about the middle category, the antagonistic with brackets, I don't know if it doesn't make sense, if it makes sense, but that was the best way to categorize this. So it's the conflict here is over varying levels of control over the penal infrastructure. So there's an ongoing relationship. It establishes rapport to share penal power. This is particularly common in decentralized settings. Change is gradual and symbiotic unless obviously it breaks down and turns destructive and completely antagonistic. And finally, the last category is this is when all actors accept the existing structures to share penal power, and reform is possible only on marginal issues because the game is set, the rules are set. So the change will be really in the details, but not big structural change. So let me return to the Turkish case. I will obviously not be able to address all of this theorization within a single case, but I think thinking in these terms, sort of not assuming states' dominance and hegemony, and to look at how penal power is shared, either as independently or within the penal infrastructure, I think it helps us. At least it helped me think about the Turkish case. I wasn't able to do that when I finished my dissertation back in 2012, but I think thinking this way, I was able to come up with a solid explanation. So I'm going to give a brief historical and institutional background about Turkey. So my focus is not on the Ottoman period, or actually, for that matter, the antagonistic conflict, the first category. I will be focusing more in the second category here. But if I were to summarize, I have a paper on this on the Ottoman period, or covers the Ottoman period as well, but it's in Turkish. Hopefully, I'll work more on it at some point. But essentially, it was the Ottoman system at this period was highly decentralized. So was punishment as well. But I'll just put it there and move on. So when we come to the late 19th and 20th century, sort of when the prisons were established in the Ottoman Empire, what we see is limited centralization. So lack of financial resources and the cycle of overcrowding and amnesties from the very beginning, except for very brief periods, what we see is complete lack of state interest, and no really, although on paper there is no really big interest in discipline, or prison discipline or rehabilitation. It's always on paper, but not really in practice. So what this leads to is what I call the warlords. This is something that Maximo would be interested, obviously. The warlords in Turkish, we say koğuş ağası. This is Ronanushi, if I'm pronouncing it right, in Tokugawa, Japan. Botsman talks about it. Or there are many examples from Maximo's edited volume in 2022. An example from that book is Jennifer Pierce's study on Dominican prisons. For instance, they talk about provos and representantes. So what I'm really talking about is prisoners, certain strongmen, or some part of a gang, or in my case here, leader of a political members of a political prisoner movement. They basically presume some sort of control, and they share the internal. The word here is internal prison governance. I think that's the word Maximo uses. So essentially, what we have here is, as a result of limited centralization, at least in the Ottoman case, as the state really does not assert very strong control, lacks the means, what we see is basically sharing penal power within the institution. And this really continues for more than a century in Turkish prisons. There are really no studies on this. All the evidence I have is from memoirs and interviews that I conducted back in early 2000s. But essentially, I see this as an example of my second category here. And it's hidden. We don't really realize there is no big conflict because this is very normalized. The parties are happy about this. And then the second sort of historical and institutional background information is the neoliberal reforms and the rise of national security agenda in 1970s and 80s. This is important because this is where we see the instrumental criminalization of the left in this period. Trying to go faster here. So let me give you more detail about the prison environment from 1970s to 1990s. What we see is the rise of strong leftist revolutionary and later Kurdish nationalist prisoner communes. These communes emerge in 1970s, but they're much smaller. They become much, much bigger because of the military coup in 1980. You see on the top left picture there, strict discipline, daily schedule, prison uniforms, physical training and education sessions, and torture. But the prisoners resist this quite well. Obviously, many people die, torture, there's several, disgusting torture stories. But essentially, thanks to these communes and hunger strikes, and in rare cases, self-immolations, prisoners really stick to each other. And when the military authorities leave prison governance after 1988, the civilian authorities take over, what we see is stronger political prisoner communes in 1990s. And I had a chapter on this on my dissertation that also got published at some point. I basically compared these two disciplinary regimes, and prisoners strongly resist in 1980s. And what we see in these political prisoner communes in 1990s is actually quite a disciplinary regime as well. What we have is strict daily plans, physical training in the morning, and then education sessions in the afternoon where they read, like Marxist communist literature. A very strict division of labor. There is someone responsible for cleaning, for kitchen duties, for mail duties, for sentry to the entrance to the ward, to the dormitory, where sometimes more than 100 people live. Um, and perhaps most importantly, the office of the political representative, sort of the leader of the commune that communicates with other communes, but also with the prison administration. There is strict enforcement in the communes. You can be warned, but also there is, I heard this from several people that I interviewed back then, that actually there is confinement within the ward. In some cases, people are basically, there is a blanketed area, a couple of bunk beds, and some prisoners are not allowed to leave there. And in the case of, in rare instances, when there are informers, there were executions as well. So essentially, sort of going towards my explanation, what we see is increasing tension between political prisoners and the state over internal prison governance. So, although it was a quite hidden example of antagonistic struggle over penal power in, throughout most of 20th century, what we see is now a visible contestation because essentially there is no agreement. There is kind of a de facto agreement because they cannot beat each other. And basically, the prison administrators recognize the communes and communal leaders, and the communes recognize prison authority. But essentially, that was a very high tension relationship. And the maximum security prisons were essentially those prisons that were based on small unit confinement were actually the state's response to capture penal power inside the prison. So the idea to forcing these prisoners in the communes, political prisoners, to the maximum security prisons was to actually break the commune where they shared everything. They were a political unit. So this was actually that I had a hard time trying to come up with an explanation because everywhere in the world we look at maximum security prisons in 2000s from 1990s onwards. The Turkish story looked kind of an outlier. I mean, overall, I don't think it is an outlier. It's not an outlier. I'll come to that at the end, hopefully, if I have time. But what we see here is a struggle over how to share power within the prison. And that I consider it as an example of my second category in my categorization. So I will go real fast here. So there were two hunger strikes. There was another major hunger strike before the one in 2000, back in 1996, in which the political prisoners were successful. You can see it here on the bottom of the left-hand side. That was not designed as a maximum security prison, but this kind of resembles American prisons. This special type prison in Eskişehir had lots of single-person units, and they all opened up to a common area. And the state wanted to transfer hundreds of political prisoners there, but the prisoners were afraid that they could be locked up there, and then they would not be able to protect their commune. And this created a crisis in 1996. But there was successful prisoner mobilization. All leftist revolutionary factions, as well as the PKK, the Kurdish nationalist movement, they were united in resistance. On the other hand, the state was not united. This was the first time a coalition government where political Islamists came to power. This was the party that President Erdogan was first elected as a mayor, as a member of this party back in 1994. There was also, thanks to involvement of public intellectuals such as Yaşar Kemal, Orhan Pamuk, and several civil society organizations, there was great media and public opinion mobilization. And essentially, when 12 prisoners died on hunger strike, the state gave up and there was an agreement and the communes continued. However, in 2000, I've showed you the pictures. The political prisoners were unsuccessful, and this was basically the tables have turned. There was great discord among the political prisoners. Not all leftist revolutionaries initially supported. PKK's leader had just been captured. So the dynamic between the state and the PKK was also different. There was a protocol basically where all state institutions regarding prisons had sort of solved their jurisdictional problems. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but essentially, the coalition, basically, I had a chapter on this as well. The fate of the reform depended on successful coalition building, both inside and outside. And eventually, the political prisoners failed in 2000, unlike in 1996. All right. How am I doing, Maximo? Uh, Good. So I have only two more slides, but I'm going to take my time here because I want to really wrap this up. So I have several conclusions. First, to understand the Turkish case, but also how can we use the framework that I'm trying to build here in other contexts as well. So the conflict was over how to share power in internal prison governance. From what we see is from warlords throughout most of 20th century to political prisoner communes to maximum security prisons. So this is actually the way I see it. This is essentially all this conflict and the formulation of maximum security prisons was essentially over this. Maximum security prison reform was an instrument to capture penal power. And so the issue, though, was not only inside, but also outside, and hence my argument that penalty should be conceived as a site and instrument in broader political struggles. And the comparison of 1996 and 2000 crises demonstrates that coalition building both inside and outside mattered. For the state, penal reform was a part of state building and centralization, and for the prisoners, resistance to penal reform was a final bid not only to sharing penal power inside, but also to participating in legitimate political action outside. And this brings me to my third point. So what we saw here in this period throughout the 1990s that ended with 2000, but also resistance continued for a while, but not successfully. Contestation over and beyond penal power reordered the boundaries of legitimate political struggle. So this starts with the leftist revolutionaries and later Kurdish nationalists' criminalization in 1970s and 80s. But political prisoners could continue to exist as legitimate political actors in public consciousness as late as 1996, both inside and outside. However, they were eliminated to a great extent from public consciousness and politics after 2000. So essentially what we see throughout this struggle, starting with their criminalization and finally their loss of how they lost penal power, the ability to share penal power, what we see is essentially an unfolding story about who can be a legitimate political actor. A question intimately connected to who we are not. Essentially, a very important question about punishment itself. So what I'm talking about here is this is not a requiem for a bygone era of resistance. I'm not writing an ode to political prisoners. I mean, I have my own political preferences, but what I want to underline here is how borders of legitimate political action was drawn through penal power and contestation over penal power. And we shouldn't think this is over. I am not sure how many of you are aware, but you might know that the presidential candidate of the main opposition party in Turkey and thrice elected mayor of metropolitan Istanbul, in addition to several district mayors, they have been in prison for almost a year now. So what we see again is essentially criminalization of political opponents. This has not stopped, and although there is no big discussion about their how they are confined, I really predict that in the near future, if this continues, again, the prisons will become under the spotlight in Turkey, kind of similar to what I just discussed. Not obviously about communes, but in terms of how it's central again, is what I'm trying to say. And finally, one other conclusion is this is sort of Chuck Tilley type of an argument, perhaps. War making in penalty over maximum security prisons has become the spearhead of the penal state in Turkey. And let me show you that I don't exaggerate here. In December 2000, when Operation Return to Life took place, the incarceration rate in Turkey was 73. This is out of 100,000. This is how we calculate the incarceration rate. As of December 2025, a quarter century later, it is 505. Turkey is globally 10th in the world, first in Europe. So, and I think Marie Gocalk makes this sort of an argument as well. Sort of all these contestation over penalty actually also in the American case, at least Gocalk argues, contributed to state building more and more capacity, which contributed to the rise of punitivism. And I think this is also what we see here in the Turkish case. And since then, I think we see ruptural penal change in early 2000s, there are new penal code, etc. But since then, actually, there is no significant public discussion over penal policy, nothing in comparison to what we saw throughout the 1990s. So I think what is going on here might be really, or at least the categorization that I had put here, as the state increased its centralized control over penal power, I think room for penal change diminished. So at least for the Turkish case, I think we can make that argument. Let me just raise a couple of implications and that'll be it. So first, theoretical presumptions of the modern state's domination over penalty risks overlooking past, silenced, or hidden struggles over this key set of relations that generate power. As I said, the penal status quo is power laden, yes, but not just through ongoing visible contestation. A snapshot of what we see might not be enough. The existing rules of the game that engender but also limit agonistic contestation are based on past and ongoing antagonistic contestations. So what we have has been built through struggles. And this is fundamentally by argument. We have to look at how penalty has been a site and instrument in broader political struggles. Coming from that, I think we can sort of use the categorization I put forward here as a methodological tool. Sort of, if you want to understand a context, what are the types of contestation over penalty? Sort of creating a map of this could really give us a better picture of what is at stake here, what are the confrontations about. And finally, I think this might also be a comparative tool to approach different cases of internal prison governance across the globe. Perhaps not just internal prison governance, but also the police authority as well, who the police respond to. So what is the contestation over this? So who does the state share penal power with? Who are the silent partners in government inside, but also outside? So, and I think actually this might be useful. And one more point, is the mode of penal power, Garland Garland's piece on penal state, I think he develops this concept quite well. Is the mode of penal power related to the extent to which it is shared and also to the form in which it is shared? There are examples to this. This is what Vanessa Barker, Lacey, or more comparative works like Cavadino and Dignan do. But this framework, but I mean, what they do is always sort of states in the global north, democratic contexts. But I think the framework that I present here extends the analysis beyond the context of democratic Western states. So we can really conceptualize the moment we stop presuming that the state has complete control and we open up to an historical understanding of how it came to be. I think there is more room for a comparative analysis. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. I've gone a little bit beyond time. I apologize for that.
Thank you very much, Arda, for this very interesting presentation. It's the first time that we are discussing the case of Turkey in our workshop series. So many thanks. It has been really interesting. So